The nurse froze when she saw her childhood photo on a blackboard in a mansion. Clara adjusted the collar of her coat as she glanced at her blurred reflection in the window. 32 years of life, and it felt as if the weight of the past few weeks had aged her at least twice that. Since losing her job at the hospital, bills seemed to multiply like shadows around her, threatening to swallow her in a bottomless pit. When the phone rang that morning, Clara assumed it was another bill collector. She wasn't prepared for a job offer. Miss Clara Mendez? The polite, feminine voice on the other end surprised her. "Yes, that's me," she replied hesitantly. "My name is Olivia. I'm Mrs. Eleonora Cardoso's housekeeper. She urgently needs a nurse, and I was informed that you're available." Clara was silent for a moment. The name Eleonora Cardoso sounded vaguely familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Her hesitation was natural. Olivia's voice had a dry, almost distant tone that made her instincts tense up. However, the woman on the line seemed used to handling situations that demanded a certain urgency. "The job requires continuous care. Mrs. Eleonora is bedridden and needs supervision throughout the night," Olivia continued. "We offer generous pay and accommodation, but you would need to remain on the property until the treatment ends." The idea of isolating herself in a mansion to care for an ailing woman stirred a wave of discomfort. But the offer was tempting, especially given her financial situation. Her last savings were about to run out, and Clara knew that turning down this opportunity could be a costly mistake. "Well, she hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "I would need to know more about her condition." "I understand. Mrs. Eleonora is an elderly woman in very fragile health," Olivia explained, her voice steady, as if reciting from a manual. "She needs constant assistance, but I assure you that nothing requires particularly advanced skills. The primary need is patience and presence. For someone like you, with your experience and background, this should be manageable." Clara frowned. How did Olivia know so much about her background? And how did she get her number? She decided that, for now, she wouldn't ask those questions. In her situation, there was no room for luxuries like curiosity. "All right. Yes, I accept. When should I start?" "There will be a car waiting for you tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Don't worry about luggage. Just bring the essentials." Mrs. Eleonora is a very particular woman, and she values discretion and respect for her peculiarities. The call ended shortly afterward, and Clara was left holding the phone, thinking about what she had just agreed to. It was a risky choice, perhaps even reckless, but at the same time, it was a chance to rebuild something in her fragmented life. The next morning, the car arrived on time. The driver, a quiet man in his middle age, wore a suit that seemed out of fashion, yet it was impeccably pressed. He opened the back door for Clara without a word, and she stepped into the vehicle, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The urban scenery soon gave way to a narrow, winding road lined with ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the gusts of wind. Clara looked out the window, watching the heavy clouds gather on the horizon, as if even the sky anticipated something grand or dark. In the distance, after nearly an hour's drive, the silhouette of a mansion appeared atop a hill, imposing and solitary. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The structure was majestic, with tall towers and old windows that seemed to peer at the world with dark, glassy eyes. The garden around the mansion was well kept, but the plants had a sinister air, as if they were silent witnesses to something that should have been forgotten. When the car stopped, the front door of the mansion opened, and the slender figure of a woman emerged. Dressed in black from head to toe, Clara knew immediately that this could only be Miss Olivia. She approached with slow, steady steps and gave Clara a calculating, inquisitive look, as if weighing and measuring her. "Welcome, Miss Mendez," the housekeeper said, nodding slightly. "I hope the journey was comfortable." Clara nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, thank you. The scenery is impressive." Miss Olivia didn't seem interested in the response. Instead, she turned and gestured for Clara to follow her. "Come, I'll show you your quarters and the wing where you'll be responsible for Mrs. Eleonora. The mansion can be a bit confusing for new residents, but I'm sure you'll adapt." They crossed the main entrance, and Clara immediately felt the air shift. The mansion's interior was dark, filled with antique furniture and long hallways where the echoes of footsteps sounded like whispers. She noticed walls lined with portraits of people from another era, serious faces, almost intimidating, that seemed to follow her with their gaze as she walked. There was something unsettling about the atmosphere, a dense, mysterious energy that seemed to envelop everything. Mrs. Eleonora needs frequent rest, so it's essential to keep quiet in this wing of the house, Mrs. Olivia continued, guiding Clara down the corridors. Clara simply nodded, taking in every detail, from the dusty tapestries to the faint smell of mildew in the air. When they reached the room that would be hers, the housekeeper opened the door and waited silently as Clara took in the space. It was simple but comfortable, a dark wooden bed, an old desk, and a single narrow window with a view of the garden that surrounded the property. "Rest up, Miss Mendez. You'll start working with Mrs. Eleonora in the late afternoon. If you have any questions, I'll be around." With one last unreadable look, Mrs. Olivia left, closing the door behind her. Clara sighed, sitting on the bed and feeling the mattress sink under her weight. She thought about her situation, the bills waiting for her, Mrs. Olivia's stern face, and the strange air of this place. She knew there was something peculiar about this mansion, something beyond what she could see or understand. But for now, what mattered was the opportunity she had in front of her. Whatever awaited her in this dark place, Clara was determined to face it. After all, it was a chance to start fresh, or at least that's what she hoped. Clara made her way down the winding stairs, guided by Mrs. Olivia's stern silhouette as she walked silently and firmly ahead. The shadows in the corridor seemed to stretch with the dim candlelight flickering on the walls, casting wavering reflections that made the paintings look almost alive. Every detail of the mansion carried the weight of time and old stories, as if secrets lay hidden within those walls, meant to remain that way. Mrs. Olivia led her to a large sitting room filled with heavy, elegant furniture, all lightly dusted. The crystal chandeliers above seemed untouched, perhaps for decades, their sparkling drops swaying gently in the dense, quiet air. "Miss Mendez, Mrs. Eleonora prefers the house to remain in its original essence," Mrs. Olivia explained, noticing Clara's gaze around the room. The idea of changes or modernizations unsettles her. Clara nodded silently. She had already sensed that the mansion held something beyond its grand, old architecture, a nearly tangible presence, as if the air itself had a memory. The heavy doors, dark curtains, and thick carpets that muffled footsteps all seemed chosen to keep a feeling of seclusion and mystery. Clara felt an unexpected shiver, but decided to shake it off. "It's just nerves," she murmured to herself. "I'd like to show you the staff wing before we start the tour of the house," said Olivia, eyeing her with a hint of distrust in her dark eyes. "There aren't many of us here, and you'll notice that we like to keep our personal space." The staff wing was in a side corridor, almost hidden, where Clara noticed two closed doors and a small, austere common room with only a wooden table and a few chairs. She sensed an uncomfortable silence, an absence of voices and conversations that felt oddly forced. One of the doors opened, and a short man with gray hair and a sparse beard walked out, passing them without even lifting his eyes. "That's Alvaro, our gardener," Olivia explained tersely. Alvaro passed by, as if he hadn't seen Clara at all, and disappeared down the hallway, hurried and hunched, almost as if he were trying to avoid any interaction. "And how many more are here?" Clara asked, trying to conceal the discomfort rising in her chest. "Just a few. Besides me and Mr. Alvaro, there's only the cook, Dona Esmeralda, and the driver, Sebastio." "We don't need more people," Olivia replied without softening her rigid expression. "Our duties are very clear. Everyone knows exactly what to do." Clara was about to respond, but Olivia had already moved on, continuing to lead her through the house. As they climbed a broad staircase to the second floor, Clara observed the details on the walls, where old portraits depicted figures from a clearly aristocratic lineage. Men and women dressed in clothing from past eras, all with serious expressions, often accompanied by children who looked like small ghosts, without a hint of a smile or joy. As they passed through one of the upstairs corridors, something caught Clara's attention. It was a dark-framed picture, hanging in a narrower hallway, flanked by heavy, dark frames. Clara frowned, finding the picture out of place, clashing with the grand decor of the mansion. "That picture," Clara murmured, stopping to look at it closely. In the dark frame was a collection of old photos. Some were sepia-toned, others almost faded, all pinned with golden tacks. The photos captured a strange, disorganized assortment of faces. Men, women, children, in places Clara didn't recognize. She noticed that some images showed the mansion itself in different eras, with groups of people standing in front of the main gate, their faces expressionless, as if posing for the photo had been an unpleasant task. But what really caught her attention were the photos of the children. Many of them were in school uniforms, of various ages, all captured in moments of apparent seriousness. Some photos were even blurry, as if they'd been taken hastily, a carelessness that stood out against the mansion's meticulous atmosphere. "Who are these people?" Clara asked, unable to contain her curiosity. She barely realized her voice sounded more anxious than she had intended. Mrs. Olivia turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Clara as if she had asked a forbidden question. "Memories of the house, Miss Mendez," she said in a tone that clearly indicated the topic should end there. "Mrs. Eleonora is a woman deeply tied to the past." Clara nodded, feeling Olivia's probing gaze on her, but a nagging sensation lingered in her mind. There was something about the faces of those children that stirred a peculiar unease in her, a nostalgia she couldn't quite explain. One particular image drew her attention, a little girl with braids and a sad expression, who seemed to be looking directly at her, almost as if she wanted to say something. "Come along, Miss Mendez. We still have much to see," Olivia urged, looking away from the wall and moving briskly down the corridor. Clara took one last look at the painting before following Olivia. Something on that wall unsettled her, something that seemed to burrow into her mind, but she chose to ignore it, forcing herself to focus on the job she had come to do. With each step, she felt as though she was leaving that shadowy corridor behind, but at the same time, it continued to linger in her thoughts like a persistent shadow. Finally, Olivia led her to Mrs. Eleanor's room. The room was large but stuffy, with closed curtains and a heavy scent of medicinal herbs and lavender, which tried to mask the faint smell of mold that hung in the air. Lying on a canopy bed, surrounded by faded lace pillows, was Mrs. Eleanora, a pale and fragile figure, as if life were slowly slipping away from her. "Mrs. Eleanora, this is Miss Clara Mendez, your new nurse," Olivia announced, bowing respectfully at the foot of the bed. Mrs. Eleanora opened her eyes slowly. There was something almost otherworldly in the way her gaze traveled around the room, as if it pierced through walls, seeing more than what lay in front of her. Her eyes were a faded gray, almost opaque, but there was no blindness there. On the contrary, They seemed like eyes that had seen too much, bearing the weight of many decades of secrets. For a moment, Clara felt exposed, as if the elderly woman could see something very personal, something she herself didn't even know she carried. When Mrs. Eleanora's eyes finally met hers, Clara had to fight the urge to look away. "Clara," the elderly woman whispered, in a voice rough and weakened by time. "Clara Mendez?" She repeated the name as if savoring a distant memory, an echo from the past. A faint tremor crossed Mrs. Eleanora's dry lips, which then softened into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes, Mrs. Eleanora. I'm here to take care of you," Clara said, trying to sound confident, though her voice carried an unease she couldn't quite hide. The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if savoring the sound of her name. Then she murmured, "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. So young, and so lonely." That last word was almost whispered, barely audible, but Clara caught it, feeling strangely affected. Lonely. The word echoed within her, stirring up memories and feelings she had tried to bury. Mrs. Eleanora opened her eyes again and looked at her with a gaze that was now more fixed, more direct. "I know why you're here," she said with surprising firmness, contrasting with her fragility. "But do you?" Clara tried to answer, but her throat felt dry. For a second, she didn't know what to say. Finally, she forced a smile, though she had the impression the old woman could see right through her professional facade. "I'm here to help, to make sure you have comfort and care." Mrs. Eleanora let out a faint laugh, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed. "Ah, yes, care," she said, shaking her head slightly as if mocking something only she understood. She glanced sideways at the housekeeper, who stood by the door, arms crossed, and with an impassive expression. "Olivia," the elderly woman called, with a tone that mixed authority and a hint of tenderness. "Will Miss Mendez be all right? Will she be strong enough?" Mrs. Olivia straightened and replied firmly, "Yes, Mrs. Eleanora. We chose someone suitable." Suitable. The word echoed in Clara's mind. What did it mean to be suitable in this place? A hint of suspicion mingled with her curiosity, but she forced herself to keep a neutral expression. Suddenly, Mrs. Eleanora raised a hand, beckoning her closer. Clara hesitated, but then slowly moved forward, leaning in close enough to hear the whisper that escaped the elderly woman's lips. "There are things in this house you cannot see, Clara. And there are things that, even if you do see, it's better not to understand." She sighed deeply, and Clara caught a faint scent of lavender mixed with something bitter from the old woman's skin. "You will find answers. But be careful with the questions." Clara felt a chill and opened her mouth to ask more, but was interrupted by the housekeeper, who discreetly cleared her throat. "Mrs. Eleanora needs her rest, Miss Mendez. Tomorrow will be a long day." Without much choice, Clara took a step back, nodding politely. "Yes, of course. Good night, Mrs. Eleanora," she said, still feeling the old woman's gaze on her like a cold breeze. As she straightened up, Mrs. Eleanora continued watching her with a peculiar expression, almost familiar. As Clara left the room, accompanied by Mrs. Olivia, she couldn't help but steal one last glance at Mrs. Eleanora. There was something unsettling in that gaze, a secret that seemed to pulse in the air around her, mingling with the scent of lavender and mystery. The door closed behind them, and Mrs. Olivia guided her back through the dark hallways. Clara wanted to ask more about what she'd just heard, about what Mrs. Eleanora had meant, but she knew she would hardly get any direct answers. "Mrs. Eleanora is a peculiar woman," Mrs. Olivia began, as if she could read Clara's thoughts. "Sometimes she says incomprehensible things. Don't let it get to you. Just do what you're asked and respect the boundaries of the house." Clara nodded, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. She looked again at the walls, at the shadows that seemed to multiply as they walked through the corridors. This house, that mansion, Mrs. Eleonora, everything felt like a riddle waiting to be solved, and at the same time, Clara felt that maybe some questions were better left unanswered. As they passed once more by the hallway with the dark framed wall filled with photos, Clara cast a closer look at the images. Her eyes landed again on the photo of the little girl with braids, caught in what seemed like a sad moment, almost as if she were lost. The child's face stirred a strange unease in her, as though a forgotten memory was struggling to resurface. "Is something wrong, Miss Mendez?" Mrs. Olivia asked, her gaze steady and penetrating. Clara forced herself to look away from the frame. "No, I was just looking at the photos. As I mentioned, they are the house's memories," Olivia replied in a tone that left no room for further questioning. Upon reaching her room, Clara closed the door behind her and took a deep breath, feeling the pressure ease a bit, away from the stern glances of the housekeeper. She sat on the bed and ran her fingers over her face, trying to shake off the anxiety gnawing at her. She thought of Mrs. Eleonora's cryptic words, Mrs. Olivia's distant tone, and the weight of those walls. Everything in that mansion seemed designed to hide something, like a truth buried under layers of dust and silence. She lay down, her mind still crowded with questions, and closed her eyes. But even in her dreams, the house seemed to give her no rest. Glimpses of dark corridors, the sad gaze of the little girl in the photo, Mrs. Eleonora's whisper about things not meant to be seen. It all seemed to blend together, forming a heavy cloud of mystery around Clara. But this was just the beginning. The mansion still held many secrets, and Clara sensed, somewhere in her mind, that sooner or later she would have to face them. Night fell over the mansion like a thick blanket of darkness, swallowing every corner of the hallways, silencing the few sounds that echoed off the old walls. Clara lay in her bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The minutes dragged on as she stared at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creaks of the old wood and the whisper of the wind blowing through the window cracks. She closed her eyes, but her mind remained restless. Images from the day ran through her head like scenes from a gloomy dream. The frail figure of Donna Eleonora, the enigmatic words about answers and dangerous questions, and most of all, the face of the little girl in the Blackboard photo. Something about that girl disturbed her deeply, as if she were connected to a memory Clara couldn't quite reach. Finally, exhaustion began to take over, and she felt herself slipping into sleep. But she soon realized that this rest would be anything but peaceful. In her dream, Clara found herself walking down a dark corridor that seemed endless. It was the same narrow hallway where the blackboard hung, but now, in the dream, it seemed to stretch on infinitely, becoming narrower with every step. There was a light mist in the air, making everything around her appear wrapped in thick, distorted shadows. She heard a sound in the distance, a soft crying, almost a wail, echoing against the stone walls. It was a child's voice, filled with anguish, making her shiver with both fear and pity. Clara tried to turn, to find the source of the sound, but the corridor kept stretching out ahead of her, growing darker with each passing moment. "Clara!" The call seemed to come from all around, muffled and sad, as if the child was trapped somewhere deep and isolated. She wanted to respond, but her voice felt frozen. A strong urge to run, to get out of that hallway, filled her, but her feet felt heavy, as though rooted to the ground. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the crying grew closer, more desperate with every step. "Help me! I'm here all alone." Suddenly, the hallway changed. Clara found herself in a small, dimly lit room, where a child sat curled up in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. It was a dark-haired girl, with her hair in two braids, exactly like the photo on the blackboard. Her face was partially hidden, but Clara somehow knew the girl was crying. The girl slowly lifted her head, revealing big, tear-filled eyes fixed on Clara with a look of despair. Clara felt a tightness in her chest as she sensed something unsettling. Those eyes seemed familiar, almost like a reflection of herself. "Why did you leave me?" murmured the child, her voice filled with sadness and pain. I didn't... Who are you?" Clara's voice sounded fragile, muffled, as if she were speaking through a layer of water. She tried to reach out to the child, but as she moved forward, the room seemed to distort, like it was being pulled away. "I'm alone, always alone," the girl repeated, her image growing more distant as Clara desperately tried to reach her. The room darkened, and the girl's sobbing turned into a piercing scream that echoed in Clara's mind like a shrill siren. "No! Wait!" Clara shouted, making one last effort to get closer to the girl. But suddenly, everything went dark. She felt herself falling, sinking into a silent, icy void. Clara woke up with a start, sitting up abruptly in bed. Her breathing was heavy, her heart racing, and her body was covered in a layer of cold sweat. It took her a few seconds to realize where she was, in the bedroom of the mansion, with the faint moonlight streaming in through the cracks in the window. She tried to calm herself, taking deep breaths, but the unease lingered, as if an invisible presence was still watching her in the dark room. She ran her hands over her face, trying to shake off the terror that had seized her. Yet something compelled her to get up, as if driven by a need beyond her own will. Clara left the bed, wrapped herself in her robe, and opened the bedroom door slowly, feeling the chill of the empty hallways surround her. The corridors were steeped in shadows, lit only by the dim light of the moon streaming through the windows. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but her steps led her back to the hallway where the black painting hung. She stopped in front of it, studying the old photographs, especially the one of the little girl with braids, who now seemed even more disturbing after the dream. "Who are you?" Clara whispered to the image, as if expecting the photograph to answer her. "Miss Mendez?" The deep, restrained voice of Mrs. Olivia broke the silence, and Clara turned around, startled. The housekeeper was standing at the end of the corridor, shrouded in shadows, with a stern gaze and a clear expression of disapproval. "What are you doing here, wandering around the house in the middle of the night?" asked Olivia, approaching with firm steps. "Shouldn't you be in your room?" Clara felt her cheeks flush. She was fully aware that her presence there, alone in the dark hallway, seemed odd, perhaps even reckless. But the urge to look at that painting was something she hadn't been able to control. I had a nightmare," she explained, her voice trembling. "I dreamed about a little girl. I thought I might hear something here." Mrs. Olivia narrowed her eyes. "Mrs. Eleonora doesn't tolerate employees wandering around the house at night, especially to avoid misunderstandings," she said in a tone that sounded almost threatening. "I suggest you return to your room and get some rest. You'll have a long day tomorrow." Clara hesitated, but knew insisting would be pointless. She nodded, casting one last glance at the picture of the girl before following the housekeeper back to her room. The way back felt even darker, and Olivia's cold gaze followed her until Clara was once again behind a closed door. Once alone again, Clara sank onto the bed, her heart still unsettled. The dream lingered in her mind, like an omen of something dark, a connection she didn't yet understand. She closed her eyes, but the image of the little girl with braids and that desperate look stayed in her mind like a haunting shadow. And amidst the silence of the room, before sleep took over again, Clara had one last, disturbing feeling that someone or something was somewhere lurking, watching her. The next morning, Clara woke up early, but the restless sleep from the night before had left its mark. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and a persistent sense of fatigue accompanied her as she got up and changed clothes. She tried to push the disturbing dream from her mind, but the images of the little girl and her mournful cries kept echoing in her thoughts, as vivid as they had been the night before. As she went down the stairs and crossed the main hallway toward the kitchen to get a coffee, her steps led her, almost instinctively, back to the darkened painting. Curiosity mixed with unease compelled her to examine the photos more closely, as if some answer lay hidden there, waiting to be uncovered. Stopping in front of the painting, Clara felt a chill. The photos gave her a strange sense of familiarity, as if she knew these people from somewhere. Her eyes scanned the serious faces and the melancholy-eyed children until her gaze fell once again on the image of the little girl with braids. Now, observing closely, she noticed that the girl's face seemed even more familiar than it had the night before. She felt a lump in her throat, but couldn't look away. Then she noticed a new photograph pinned right at the center of the board. Clara approached, puzzled. The image was a small black and white photo, slightly faded at the edges, showing a young girl wearing an old-school uniform, with short hair and a curious yet serious expression. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure. It was herself. She froze, her heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sounds around her. It was impossible. The photo showed a younger version of herself, maybe around 5 or 6 years old, wearing a uniform she vaguely remembered from when she attended a small school in the countryside before being adopted by her current family. She recognized the look in the photo, the introspective expression that had always been with her as a child. Clara took a step back, her body trembling, trying to process what she was seeing. How could a photo from her childhood be on that board? And what did it mean to be there, among so many other children? 1,000 questions burst into her mind, but no answer seemed to make sense. She reached out, touching the edge of the photo with trembling fingers, feeling as if she were in a dream, something between reality and the impossible. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Clara turned and met the cold, watchful gaze of Mrs. Olivia, who was observing her from the end of the hallway. The housekeeper's expression was impassive, but there was something in her eyes that made Clara shiver, a suspicious, calculated glint. "Did you see something that interests you, Miss Mendez?" Olivia asked in a low voice, almost a whisper, as if her question held a double meaning. Clara tried to hide her shock, but couldn't stop her voice from shaking. "This photo, how did it get here?" "That's me, when I was a child." Mrs. Olivia stayed silent for a long moment, her eyes studying Clara with an intensity that bordered on discomfort. Then she gave a slight smile, but the gesture held no warmth. "Curious, isn't it? Mrs. Eleonora has always enjoyed collecting memories, but it doesn't make sense. I was never here as a child. I didn't even know this house existed," Clara exclaimed, trying to keep control, though she felt her nerves slipping. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her smile still frozen on her face. "There are many things you don't understand about this house and about yourself, it seems." Her tone was enigmatic, almost ironic. Perhaps Mrs. Eleonora might be willing to clarify a few things. If she wishes to. Clara took a deep breath, her mind spinning. All of this felt increasingly surreal, like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but she knew that Olivia wouldn't reveal anything beyond what she deemed appropriate. The housekeeper always seemed to be in control, and Clara was beginning to feel that, for her, any desperation or confusion Clara displayed was just one more reason to reinforce the mystery surrounding the mansion. Without saying another word, Olivia walked past her, moving down the hallway like an unrelenting shadow, leaving Clara behind, alone with her questions. Clara looked back at the photo, touching it with her thumb, as if the gesture could bring her back to the time when that image was taken. Memories of her foster childhood came in scattered flashes. The small house where she had grown up, the affection of her foster parents, and the brief, almost invisible memories of a previous past, fragments of a home she never truly knew. "Why is this photo here?" she murmured to herself, feeling a wave of disorientation. She knew there was something fundamental, something buried in her past, connected to this house and to Mrs. Eleonora. But she couldn't remember what it was. With a heavy heart, she decided to follow Olivia's advice and speak directly with Mrs. Eleonora. Maybe the old woman knew more about the photo and why it was there. She walked down the hallway, trying to ignore the unsettling gazes of the old portraits on the walls, which seemed to watch her silently with an expression of judgment. When she reached Mrs. Eleonora's room, Clara knocked on the door and heard the faint voice of the elderly woman inviting her in. She opened the door and found the old lady leaning back on pillows, her head lowered, her eyes half closed. When Clara entered, she lifted her gaze, and a faint smile of recognition appeared on her face. "Mrs. Eleonora," Clara began hesitantly. I found something in the frame in the hallway. A photo of me from when I was a child." Mrs. Eleonora watched her in silence, her gray eyes inscrutable, as if trying to gauge the depth of the questions Clara carried with her. After a moment, the old woman spoke, her voice faint but loaded with meaning. "Yes, you found the photo, didn't you? I knew you would see it sooner or later." She sighed, her eyes lost in something only she could see. "It's no coincidence that you're here, Clara. All of this was planned a long time ago." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Planned? What do you mean? I don't understand. How is my photo here? I didn't even know I had any connection to this house." Mrs. Eleonora closed her eyes, as if the conversation demanded a strength she no longer possessed. "There are things you have forgotten, my dear. Things that were taken from you." Clara moved closer, feeling a mix of dread and fascination. "Was I a part of this family? Did I live here?" Mrs. Eleonora slowly opened her eyes and looked at her with a deep, melancholic gaze. "Yes, you are blood of my blood, a part of this house, of this place." She extended a trembling hand, which Clara took, feeling the coldness of the old woman's skin against her fingers. "You were taken from me when you were little, for reasons that you may discover when the time comes." Mrs. Eleonora's words echoed in Clara's mind, opening a chasm of questions she didn't know how to answer. The mystery of the house now seemed darker, denser, as if she had been drawn into a web of secrets far older than she could have imagined. "But why?" Clara pressed, almost desperate. "Why was I taken? And why now? Why is that photo there, like a reminder?" Mrs. Eleonora gave a sad smile and squeezed Clara's hand with surprising strength. "The past has a way of finding us, even if we try to forget it. You've returned to where you've always belonged, Clara. Now it's a matter of discovering what that means." Clara remained silent, unsure of how to react. Everything felt surreal, as if she were part of a dark play with a hidden script. But at the same time, the feeling that somehow, inexplicably, she had always belonged to that place was growing inside her. Looking into Mrs. Eleonora's eyes, Clara realized that this was just the beginning. The mansion and the secrets of that family held much more than she could imagine. And something told her that uncovering her past would lead her down paths she might wish she had never taken. Mrs. Eleonora's words left Clara in a state of growing confusion and anxiety. The idea that she was blood of the blood of that family, that she had a connection to that mysterious, imposing house, was hard to process. Yet, at the same time, it awakened a strange sense of belonging in her. It was as if every hallway, every old portrait, every creak of the aged would stir a distant memory, just beginning to emerge from the shadows of forgetfulness. Clara went about her work throughout the day, helping Mrs. Eleonora with basic care and managing her medications. Though the old woman was frail, there were moments when she appeared surprisingly lucid and insightful. On several occasions, Clara felt that Mrs. Eleonora watched her with an unsettling intensity, as if she were seeing something far beyond the appearance of her new nurse. Perhaps something in her spirit, a mark only she could recognize. It was at the end of that afternoon, as Clara adjusted Mrs. Eleonora's pillows, that the old woman broke the silence with an unexpected question. "You've been dreaming, haven't you, Clara?" Clara stopped in the middle of the movement and looked at the woman, trying to hide her surprise. How could she know about the strange and disturbing dreams that had been haunting her since she arrived? The memory of the girls crying in her dream, the feeling of being lost in that dark hallway, all of it came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. "Yes, I've been having some nightmares," she admitted hesitantly. "But I don't know if they mean anything." Mrs. Eleonora let out a deep sigh, closing her eyes for a moment before responding. "Ah, dear, you're starting to remember. I knew the past would find a way to seep back into you. Our memory, it never truly leaves us. It just sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Remember what? Can you tell me what all this means? Why am I here?" Mrs. Eleonora opened her eyes, and they were brighter than Clara had ever seen, as if an old, determined fire was burning in her gaze. The elderly woman took Clara's hand firmly and pulled her closer, surprisingly strong for someone with such a frail appearance. "There's a curse on this house, Clara. A curse that goes back generations," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if she feared the very walls of the mansion could hear her. "It all started with my grandmother, a woman of great ambition and little scruples. She made choices that cursed our bloodline." Clara felt her stomach twist at the word curse. She didn't believe in such things, but Mrs. Eleonora's serious, weighty tone made it all feel dangerously real. What does this curse have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Eleonora gave a sad smile. "Everything, my dear. This curse isn't just an old wives' tale. It's like a shadow that haunts every descendant of our family. And you, Clara, are one of us. No matter how far they try to run, members of our bloodline always come back to this house, as if something pulls them back, like they're tied by invisible strings." Clara was about to ask another question, but Mrs. Eleonora gripped her hand tighter, as if wanting her to listen to the end without interruption. "Many years ago, you were taken from here when you were just a baby. I had to give you up for adoption to protect you. Your adoptive parents raised you as their own, but you've always been a part of this house. Part of this secret," the elderly woman explained, with a glimmer of pain in her eyes. Clara swallowed hard. "But why? Why give me to another family? What were you trying to protect me from?" Mrs. Eleonora looked at her, and for a moment, Clara saw pure anguish on her aging face. "Because children in our family are never safe. There's a dark force, a presence that haunts this house and claims our children. A child disappeared here many years ago, and the memories of that horror still haunt every generation." Clara felt a chill run through her. The memory of her dream, the crying girl, the feeling of being lost and trapped, came back with painful clarity. "When you were born, Clara, I knew the same fate could befall you. I couldn't take that risk. That's why I took you away from this place, trusting that, far from here, you would be safe." Mrs. Eleonora's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, as though the guilt of her decision still weighed heavily on her. "But the curse is stronger than any effort. And one day it found you. It brought you back to us." Clara was stunned, her mind full of questions and disjointed images. She had never believed in curses or supernatural forces, but the intensity of Mrs. Eleanor's words made it impossible to ignore what she was hearing. And the girl in the painting, the one with braids, who is she? Clara asked, almost in a whisper. Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, as if remembering that child caused her unbearable pain. She was my sister. You're great. She disappeared when she was little, just like many other children in the family over the years. We believe her spirit still roams this house, trapped, unable to rest. Clara felt a deep shiver. So the little girl from my dreams, it's her. She's trying to communicate with you, trying to find peace. But this curse, Clara, it holds spirits captive. They're trapped here like shadows, as long as this house stands. Mrs. Eleanor looked at her with a weary, sad expression, her eyes shining with a mix of resignation and hope. And maybe you're the only one who can set them free. Clara backed away, frightened. Set them free? She, a simple nurse who had taken the job out of desperation, now seemed destined for something far darker and more complex. A feeling of panic began to squeeze her chest, as if the walls around her were closing in. No, this is too much. It doesn't make sense, she stammered, feeling on the verge of collapse. Mrs. Eleanor extended a trembling hand and touched her face with unexpected tenderness. I know it's frightening, my dear, but this house, it's your inheritance, and also your burden. Only you can face it. Clara remained silent, processing everything she had heard. She wanted to reject it all, to step away from that unbearable responsibility. But a part of her, something deep and primal, seemed to recognize the truth in the elderly woman's words. It was as if an ancestral flame was stirring within her, rekindling memories and feelings she didn't even know existed. When Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes again, tired from the intensity of the conversation, Clara stepped back, respecting the older woman's need to rest. She left the room, still dazed, with Mrs. Eleanor's words echoing in her mind like a painful riddle. As she walked down the silent hallway, she felt that presence again, as if the mansion were alive, watching her, testing her courage. And as she passed by the dark painting, Clara took one last look at the picture of the little girl with braids. That image was now more than a mystery. It was a call, a demand. The girl wasn't just trapped in the painting, but somewhere deep and dark, waiting for someone to come and set her free. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a responsibility she was beginning to accept, though reluctantly. She didn't know what she would do next, but one thing was certain. This place, this house, this hidden past, all of it had drawn her back for a reason. And now, Clara knew she couldn't run from it. That night, as the mansion sank into absolute silence, Clara couldn't shake off Mrs. Eleanor's words from her mind. The idea of a curse spanning generations, of missing children, and of spirits trapped in the house seemed to disturb every cell in her body. But at the same time, there was something that drew her in, an almost instinctual urge to uncover more. Restless and unable to sleep, Clara decided she needed to find answers for herself. Something told her that the mansion held more secrets than Mrs. Eleanor had shared, and she had a strong suspicion about where these secrets might be hidden. The attic. During the brief tour she'd received of the house on the first day, Mrs. Olivia had mentioned the attic in a vague and prohibitive way, saying there was no need for Clara to go up there. Back then, it had seemed like just an odd comment. Now, however, it felt like a veiled warning, something that sounded more like an order than a suggestion. The attic might very well be where the house's secrets were locked away. Guided by this thought, Clara grabbed a flashlight and opened her bedroom door carefully to avoid making noise. The housekeeper and the other staff were probably asleep by now, but she didn't want to risk drawing anyone's attention. Taking light steps, she moved down the hall, averting her gaze from the dark painting where her own picture still hung, like a sinister sentinel of her past. He climbed the narrow stairs that led to the attic, trying to ignore the creaks of the old floor echoing through the silence of the house. When he reached the top, he found himself in front of a heavy door made of dark, rustic wood, with a handle that looked like it had seen decades of use. He took a deep breath, gathering courage, and turned the handle. The door creaked, opening slowly and revealing a dense darkness, interrupted only by the beam of the flashlight. The attic was spacious but cluttered with boxes, furniture covered with yellowed sheets, and shelves filled with objects that seemed to have been there for centuries. Clara could smell the dust and mold mixed with something subtler, an almost sweet aroma she couldn't quite identify. The atmosphere was heavy, carrying an oppressive feeling that seemed to warn her to leave, to not go any further. But she ignored the warning and stepped inside, driven by the need to understand what tied her to that house. Clara began exploring the space, randomly opening some of the boxes. She found old photo albums with images of people who were probably her ancestors. Stern faces, hard stares, their expressions leaving no room for smiles. In one of the boxes, she found a porcelain doll with black hair and an oddly familiar expression. She remembered the little girl with braids in the photo, supposedly her great-aunt, and felt a chill at the thought that the doll might have belonged to her. She continued exploring, running her fingers over yellowed letters and dusty journals that looked ready to crumble at a touch. Then, in the back of the attic, something caught her attention. A small, antique writing desk with a drawer slightly ajar, almost begging to be investigated. Clara knelt in front of the desk and pulled open the drawer. At the bottom, covered in a layer of dust, was a hardcover journal with worn edges and moisture stains. When she opened it, she realized the diary had been written by a child. The uneven handwriting and little drawings in the page margins gave it away. She skimmed through the first few pages, and her heart raced as she read the name in the upper corner. Eleonora Cardoso, dated several decades back. This was the childhood of Donna Eleonora. She was the author of the diary, though she must have been very young when she began writing it. Clara read carefully, her eyes tracing over entries about innocent games and a garden that no longer existed. But then, as she read on, the tone of the words began to change. In one entry, dated a winter night, young Eleonora described her growing fear of a presence in the house. She wrote about hearing footsteps on the stairs at night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and about her younger sister, Beatrice, the little girl with braids in the photo. Bea said she saw a woman in a black dress in her room, one of the passages read. But Mom and Dad said it's just our imagination. I know they're wrong. Sometimes I see her too, standing in the corner of the room, watching. Clara felt a deep chill. Beatrice, the little girl who appeared in her dreams, the one who cried, lost, seemed to be the same girl Eleonora mentioned in her diary. And that mysterious figure, the woman in the black dress, added a new layer to the mystery, as if the presence described was part of the curse the family seemed to carry. She kept reading, devouring every word. In one of the last entries, young Eleonora wrote about Beatrice's disappearance. The writing was messy, as if done in a hurry, with shaky handwriting. Bea disappeared last night. Mom is desperate. Dad isn't talking to anyone. I know the woman in black took her. I try to tell them, but no one believes me. They think it's the fault of some old spirit, but I know it's more than that. Bea is still here somewhere. I can feel her. From that point on, the diary entries became sparse, fragmented, and the last page was stained, as if a tear had blurred the ink. After that, the diary ended abruptly. Clara closed the book, her chest tight, her mind filled with a sense of sadness and fear. Little Beatrice, Mrs. Eleanor's sister, had disappeared within those same walls, taken by an entity the family had never been able to identify. And now, Clara felt that Beatrice's presence, or something related to her, continued to wander through the house, trapped by invisible forces, waiting for someone who could set her free. As she was about to get up, she noticed a detail she had missed before. There was a small photograph tucked into the inside cover of the diary. It was an old photo of two girls holding hands, both dressed in period clothes. Clara instantly recognized Mrs. Eleanora, young and smiling, and beside her, a little girl with braids, Beatrice. The image seemed to capture a happy moment between the two, but now, with what she knew, that image carried a somber aura, a reminder of what was lost forever. As she put away the diary and the photo, Clara noticed something moving at the back of the attic. The beam of her flashlight revealed a small, quick shadow disappearing behind a stack of boxes. She froze, her heart racing, eyes fixed on where she had seen the movement. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the air around her felt cold, as if an invisible presence was watching her. "Beatrice," she whispered, not knowing why she was calling the child's name. Only silence replied. But for a brief moment, Clara thought she heard a faint sound, almost inaudible, the muffled crying of a child, echoing through the old walls. She felt her heart tighten, as if something inside her recognized that pain, that loneliness. But before she could try to understand what she was feeling, the sound disappeared, and the attic returned to an absolute silence. Clara left the attic, still trembling, carrying the diary and the photograph. As she went down the stairs, she felt as if each step brought her closer to a terrible, ancient secret that had been waiting for her since before she was born. The history of the mansion, the story of her family, the story of Beatrice. Everything seemed intertwined, and now she was part of this tangle of secrets that were crying out to be revealed. Back in her room, she closed the door and held the diary against her chest, as if it could protect her from what was to come. She knew that with each revelation, she was getting closer to something dangerous, something the mansion was desperately trying to keep hidden. But in that moment, Clara knew she couldn't stop. The night Clara spent after the discovery in the attic was filled with a light, restless sleep, haunted by shadows and whispers that seemed to float around her. The secret she had read in Eleanor's diary wouldn't give her peace. The idea that her great-aunt Beatrice might still somehow be trapped in that place tormented her. Like a small flame burning in the back of her mind, the image of the girl with braids and the echo of her crying remained, unsettling and insistent. The next day, Clara decided she couldn't go on in this state of uncertainty. She needed answers, and the only person in the house who seemed to know the truth, besides Eleanora, was Donna Olivia. The housekeeper clearly knew more than she let on and, until that moment, had been the inflexible guardian of the mansion's mysteries. After breakfast, Clara found Donna Olivia in the kitchen, overseeing the cook as she prepared tea for Mrs. Eleanora. The housekeeper always seemed busy, but her movements were meticulous, as if she had absolute control over everything that happened in the house. When Clara entered, Olivia gave her a quick glance, assessing her presence with the same impassive expression as always. "I need to talk to you, Donna Olivia," Clara said, trying to sound firm. There was tension in the air, as if they both knew this moment was inevitable. Donna Olivia sighed softly, not hiding her displeasure. "About what, Miss Mendez?" "About the history of this house. About Beatrice." "And about me," Clara said, hesitant but determined. Olivia narrowed her eyes, observing her coldly. "Mrs. Eleanora has already told you what she thinks you should know. I don't see the need to prolong this conversation." Clara felt her face flush, a mix of anger and frustration she had managed to hold back until now. I think I know more than you realize, she replied, gripping Eleanora's diary tightly, almost like a weapon. For a moment, Olivia's expression faltered, her gaze fixed on the old book with a glint of warning. She pressed her lips together, taking a deep breath before responding, as if she needed to control something within herself. "And what is it you think you know, Miss Mendez?" she said, her tone thick with sarcasm. "Do you think a child's diary can reveal the depths of this family's secrets?" Clara stepped forward, facing her. "I know about the curse. I know that Beatrice disappeared in this house, that her spirit is still trapped here, and that I was taken away so I wouldn't meet the same fate. But it seems it was all in vain, wasn't it? The house itself brought me back." Mrs. Olivia stared at her, unblinking, the mask of control hardening once more on her face. "There are things you don't understand, child. Secrets that should remain buried. Secrets that you protect." Clara shot back, unable to hold back the accusing tone. "Why? Why stay here, keeping these mysteries, as if you have some loyalty to something that's clearly evil?" The housekeeper hesitated, but her gaze turned icy. "I protect what I was entrusted to protect. Mrs. Eleanora and this house are my responsibility. They always have been. My duty is to preserve order, not to indulge the curiosity of a child who has lost her way." Clara felt her anger rising within her. "I'm not a child anymore, and whether you like it or not, this house is a part of me too. You can keep hiding whatever you want, but I will uncover the truth." Mrs. Olivia let out an exasperated sigh, and for a brief moment, something in her look seemed almost sympathetic. "Very well, Miss Mendez. You want to know the truth? I'll tell you what none of the words in that diary dare to reveal." She motioned for Clara to follow her and led her to a room on the ground floor she rarely used, an old-fashioned office filled with shelves and antique objects. Mrs. Olivia closed the door behind them and turned to Clara with a serious look, as if she was finally about to open a part of her own soul. "You know about the curse," Olivia began in a low voice, "but perhaps you don't understand what it really means. The Cardoso family has always been a prosperous and influential family, but that prosperity came at a price. Your great-grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor's grandmother, did something unthinkable to secure the family's rise. On a dark night, she sealed a pact with forces beyond human understanding." Clara listened in silence, her heart racing. The idea of a dark pact sounded like something out of a nightmare, but everything about that house gave her the sense that horror could, indeed, be real. She offered the blood of her future generations, the blood of her descendants, in exchange for prosperity. "Since then, each generation has had to pay the price," Olivia continued. "First, the children of servants disappeared. Then, the grandchildren of neighbors. But when the main lineage was affected, it was Beatrice who paid the price. The innocent child this house took for itself." Clara covered her mouth, horrified. "This is monstrous, and no one did anything?" Olivia crossed her arms, her face hardened. "Some tried, but this force, this thing, is old and insatiable, and it keeps demanding its share. That's why I was sent for adoption," Clara said, as if finally understanding the role she'd been given. "I was a potential sacrifice, but Donna Eleonora wanted to protect me, taking me out of this house." Olivia nodded, but her gaze remained cold. "Yes, but as you yourself said, the house brought you back. The family's blood always returns, whether to confront it or to yield to it. Donna Eleonora wanted to protect you, but I always knew fate would be stronger. That's why I never believed you could escape forever." Clara closed her eyes, trying to process the revelation. The fate that fell upon her was darker than she had ever imagined. She felt the weight of her family's history pressing down on her, as if the curse was now on her shoulders, waiting for her next move. "And what will happen to me?" she whispered, more to herself than to Olivia. Donna Olivia looked at her with a grave expression. "You have two choices, Clara. You can try to resist and face whatever is trapped in this house, or you can accept what this force demands. One way or another, you'll have to decide." The silence that followed was deep and crushing. Clara knew that, on some level, Olivia was warning her about something beyond her words. There was a choice there, a decision that would have terrible consequences. "And you? Where do you stand in all of this?" Clara asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you trapped here too?" Olivia hesitated, and her eyes, for a brief moment, looked almost sad. "I'm here because I swore to serve this family. I'm not afraid of the mansion's shadows, for I am a part of it. My loyalty is to Signora Eleonora and to what remains of this house. And that is all that matters." Clara felt the urgency and weight of the housekeeper's words, and for the first time, she realized that Olivia wasn't just a strict, controlling figure. She was someone who bore the responsibility of protecting deep secrets, someone who was willing to sacrifice anything to keep the balance of that dark place. Even so, Clara knew she couldn't just accept all of this without a fight. If the family curse was real, if the sacrifice was inevitable, she would have to confront these forces to see if there was a way to free not only Beatrice, but also herself from that cycle of horror. She took a deep breath, feeling a determination grow within her. Olivia watched her in silence, and Clara saw a mixture of respect and concern in her gaze. "So that's it," Clara said with a calm resolve. "I will face whatever this house holds. If there's a way to free Beatrice and put an end to all of this, I'll find it." Mrs. Olivia remained silent, but something in her expression softened. "If that's your choice, so be it. But remember, Miss Mendez, this house doesn't forgive. And what you'll find here may be far more terrifying than you imagine." With those words, the housekeeper left the room, leaving Clara alone. The weight of what lay ahead seemed overwhelming, but she knew there was no turning back. The final confrontation with the mansion's secrets was inevitable, and this time, Clara was ready to face whatever waited for her in the shadows. Night fell over the mansion with a heaviness greater than usual. Every shadow on the walls seemed thicker. Every noise seemed amplified, echoing through the halls like a dark call. Clara knew she was reaching her limit. The conversation with Mrs. Olivia had shed some light on her family's dark past, but had also left a sense of powerlessness. How does one face a curse? How do you challenge invisible forces that, for generations, had claimed the lives of the innocent? But the answer was right there. Beatrice's presence still lingered in the mansion, calling out for help. And Clara felt, with an inexplicable intensity, that her own fate was tied to her gray tants. Maybe it was the shared bloodline. Maybe it was just chance, but she knew, somehow, she was the only one who could free that trapped spirit. With determination pulsing through her veins, Clara made a decision. That night, she wouldn't run from her fears. She would face the family curse, Beatrice's spirit, and whatever else lurked in the dark corners of the mansion. She didn't know what awaited her, but she was certain she had to do it. For Beatrice, for Mrs. Eleonora, and for herself. She approached the black-framed picture, where her own childhood photo was still pinned beside other images of missing children. She looked at her younger self's face, trying to imagine what that little girl would think of all this. "I'm here now," she murmured, almost like a promise. She took a deep breath and climbed the stairs to the second floor, walking down the long hallway where shadows danced under the shaky light of her flashlight. Something inside her pulled her toward the room where Beatrice herself had slept decades ago. The door creaked as she opened it, as if it resisted her presence, but Clara stepped in with determined strides. Beatrice's room was small, but it felt frozen in time. A bed with embroidered quilts was perfectly made, and a porcelain doll lay on the pillow, its empty glass eyes seeming to look at her with a sad expression. Clara felt a chill. The doll, with its old-fashioned features, eerily resembled Beatrice's own face. Suddenly, the air around Clara felt colder. A sense of presence filled the room, dense and heavy, as if something unseen had entered with her. A shiver ran down her spine, but she stood her ground. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered her gray-tant's name. "Beatrice, I'm here. If you can hear me, please show me what happened. Show me how I can help." The silence was so deep that Clara could hear the sound of her own breathing echoing through the room. Then, a faint whisper, like a cold breeze, swept through the air. "Clara." The voice was weak, barely a murmur, but Clara heard it clearly. She opened her eyes and saw, in the corner of the room, a small, indistinct figure, like a shadowy mist slowly taking shape. The figure was that of a young girl with braided hair, dressed in an old-fashioned dress. Beatrice's dark, sorrowful eyes met hers, and Clara felt a wave of compassion and pain. "Beatrice," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Beatrice's figure reached out her hand, as if she wanted Clara to come closer. Hesitantly, Clara took a step forward, then another, until she was just inches from the ethereal image of the girl. When she reached out to touch the figure, she felt an icy chill, but at the same time, a sense of deep connection, almost as if she were looking at a reflection of herself. "Help me," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling and frightened. "I'm trapped. I can't get out." Clara felt tears well up in her eyes. "How can I help you? What do I need to do?" Beatrice tilted her head, her dark eyes fixed on Clara's. "The house. It doesn't want me to leave. There's something holding me here. Something old and evil." The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and Clara felt an even stronger presence, like the walls around her were closing in. Beatrice's shadow began to fade, as if something were trying to pull her away. Clara reached out desperately, trying to hold on to her. "Beatrice, no, wait, tell me what to do." But the girl vanished, like mist blown away by the wind. Where she had been, a cold current seemed to pulse, radiating a sense of imminent danger. Clara stood frozen, trying to catch her breath and make sense of what had just happened. Suddenly, the bedroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight in her hand flickered, then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Clara's heart raced, and she felt panic creeping through her. But before she could do anything, an overwhelming presence filled the space. A deep, almost growling sound echoed around her, coming from all directions. Clara felt the pressure of that invisible entity, something immensely powerful and utterly malevolent. It felt like an ancient force, a presence that had fed on fear and pain for generations. Then, in a low, distorted whisper, a voice filled the room. "She's mine just like you." Clara swallowed hard, terror flooding every fiber of her being. The presence surrounded her, as if trying to infiltrate her mind, planting a seed of despair within her. But amid the fear, Clara found a spark of resistance. She took a deep breath and lifted her head, challenging the entity. "You may have trapped Beatrice," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But I'm here to free her, and I won't let you keep up this curse." The entity let out a low, menacing noise, like a distant, monstrous laugh. "You're just a lost child like so many others. You can't fight what you don't understand." Clara closed her eyes, searching for strength within herself, an anchor to hold on to in that confrontation. Then she remembered the prayers she'd learned from her adoptive mother, words of faith that had always comforted her in the hardest moments. She murmured these words, feeling her courage grow. I'm not alone, she whispered, repeating the words of the prayer. There's light and strength within me, and I won't allow you to keep imprisoning the innocent. The presence seemed to shudder upon hearing Clara's words. The room began to shake, as if the very structure of the house was reacting to the clash between the entity and Clara's willpower. The pressure in the air lessened slightly, and the cold sensation started to fade. Amidst the confusion, Clara felt a light, cold touch on her hand. She opened her eyes and saw Beatrice's figure again, this time clearer, more real. The girl smiled, a timid smile, and squeezed Clara's hand as if begging her not to let go. I'm with you, Beatrice, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. I promise I'll set you free. The room seemed to light up briefly, as if a soft glow was emanating from within Beatrice herself. The entity let out one final scream, a piercing sound of hatred and frustration, before vanishing into the shadows. Gradually, silence returned to the room, and the oppressive presence disappeared. Beatrice looked at Clara one last time, with a gaze full of gratitude and peace, before her figure slowly faded into the air. This time, Clara knew she wasn't being pulled back by the mansion's malevolent force. No, Beatrice's spirit was finally free. Clara remained there, in the empty room, feeling exhausted but, at the same time, filled with a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The mansion was still a dark place, but she knew something had changed. Something had been broken. With slow steps, she left the room, breathing deeply as she walked through the hallways in silence. The weight of the curse was still there, but Beatrice's release was a victory, a small spark of hope in a sea of shadows. And Clara knew that, from that moment on, her life would never be the same. The silence after the supernatural experience with Beatrice still lingered over Clara as she went down the stairs the next morning. She felt strangely light, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but at the same time, she knew the fight was far from over. The mansion continued to whisper around her, holding on to ancient secrets that resisted the light of day. As she entered the main hall, she found Donna Eleonora sitting in her armchair, looking more fragile than ever. The housekeeper, Donna Olivia, was by her side, holding her hand in a rare gesture of tenderness, as if she knew Eleonora's time was running out. When Clara entered, both of them looked up, and the intensity on the housekeeper's face revealed that she knew. Somehow, she knew what had happened the night before. Donna Eleonora gestured for Clara to come closer, and Clara obeyed, sitting beside the elderly woman. The old lady's gray eyes, usually so distant and evasive, were now filled with emotion, as if they could see something no one else could. Clara, began Donna Eleonora, her voice trembling. I felt what happened. Beatrice, she's finally at peace, isn't she? Clara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Yes, she's free now. I don't feel her presence in the house anymore. A tired, relieved smile appeared on the old woman's lips. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if praying in silence. You did what I couldn't do all these years, my dear. You set my sister free, released her from the darkness haunting this house. For so long, I thought it would never be possible. Donna Olivia remained by the elderly woman's side, her usually stern expression softened by the moment's emotion. Clara noticed that even the housekeeper, normally so strict and controlled, seemed moved by Beatrice's release. It was as if that act of compassion and bravery had begun to lift the weight of the curse over everyone there. But there's still more we need to do, isn't there? Clara asked, keeping her eyes on Eleonora. Freeing Beatrice is just the beginning. The mansion, the family, they still bear this weight, this curse. I feel like we're still trapped. Eleonora opened her eyes, and there was a deep sadness there. as if she'd carried the pain of generations in her chest. Yes, Clara, Beatriz is free, but the curse still clings to the walls of this house. This evil that was summoned by the family's blood, it demands forgiveness. It needs peace. Donna Olivia, who had been silent until then, took a deep breath and spoke in a gentler tone than Clara had ever heard. A cleansing ritual is needed, Miss Mendez. The mansion must be purified. Senora Eleonora, as the direct descendant and the one who kept silent for so many years, must play a central role in this. Eleonora nodded, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. But I can't do it alone, she murmured, reaching her trembling hand toward Clara. I need you, Clara. I need you to help me beg for forgiveness. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. To free you. To free this house. Donna Olivia rose and gathered the few servants in the house. Though there were only a handful of them, herself, the gardener Alvaro, the cook Esmeralda, and the driver Sebastio, Clara realized that each of them carried a part of the mansion's dark weight. They were guardians, aware or not, of the family secret. Olivia gathered them in the living room, forming a silent and reverent circle around Eleonora and Clara. Dusk was approaching as everyone prepared for the purification ritual. Clara held Eleonora's hand firmly, while Donna Olivia guided the servants, who formed a circle around them. The housekeeper began leading an ancient prayer, a supplication passed down through generations of the family, almost a whispered plea of remorse and repentance. This blood will no longer imprison us. May the pain and suffering fade away. May light take the place of the darkness that has resided for so long, murmured Donna Olivia, her voice low and filled with solemnity. As the prayer continued, Clara closed her eyes and focused, feeling a warm presence filling the room. She held Eleonora's hand more tightly, conveying to the elder all the compassion and love she could still gather in her heart. It was a plea for peace, a cry for liberation, not only for Beatriz, but for all the souls that had been drawn into the curse. Suddenly, Clara felt a gentle pressure on her shoulder, a presence beside her that she couldn't see but deeply sensed. When she opened her eyes, she almost saw Beatriz by her side, her ethereal figure watching the ritual with a look of peace and gratitude. Clara felt a deep calm envelop her heart, as though the house itself was being surrounded by a force of light, a purifying presence dispelling the shadows. As the prayer intensified, Donna Eleonora began to cry quietly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. With a voice choked with emotion, the elder murmured, "Forgive me, Beatriz. Forgive me for not being able to protect you. Forgive me for letting the darkness prevail." Clara squeezed Eleonora's hand, offering her support, and gently said, "She has already forgiven you, Donna Eleonora. She has found peace. Now it's time for you to find yours as well." And in that moment, Clara felt something break, like an invisible chain around them all had finally snapped. The air in the room seemed lighter, as if the shadows had finally been driven out, and a gentle, welcoming light filled the space. The room was filled with an uncommon serenity, as though the mansion itself sighed in relief, freed from centuries of pain and secrecy. Beatriz's presence began to fade, but not before casting one last look at Clara, a look of pure gratitude. Clara knew, with unshakable certainty, that her great-aunt was finally at peace. She smiled at the girl's spirit, whispering a silent farewell as the image faded, dissolving into the light. When the ritual ended, the circle slowly dissolved. Donna Eleonora was exhausted, but there was a serene smile on her face, a smile that no longer carried the weight of guilt. Clara helped her stand, and the elder embraced her tightly, the two holding each other for a long moment, feeling the connection that bound them. "Thank you, Clara," whispered Donna Eleonora. "You have saved this house and our family. I will never be able to thank you enough." Clara felt her heart warm at that statement, but she knew it wasn't just for Eleonora that she had done all of it. There was a new hope within her, a sense of redemption, not only for her family, but also for herself. She had faced the darkness and found the light. Gradually, the staff left, leaving Eleonora and Clara alone in the room, wrapped in a silence that was no longer threatening. It was a silence of peace, a silence of new beginnings. The mansion now seemed different. The shadows that once gathered in the corners had vanished, and even the air felt lighter. Clara knew there was still much to resolve, but that battle, the most important one, was won. She and Eleonora had finally freed the house from the darkness that had held it captive for so long. With a new calm, Clara helped the elderly woman up the stairs to her room, where Eleonora could rest. And as they walked, Clara felt ready for a future where shadows would no longer dictate her family's destiny. In the days that followed the ritual, the atmosphere in the mansion changed almost palpably. Clara woke up each morning with a sense of lightness that had once seemed impossible. The dark hallways no longer bothered her. The shadows that once felt laden with threats now had a serene quality, as if the very space had finally found peace. Even the black-framed picture in the hall, where her childhood photos still hung, had lost that eerie and mysterious weight. Now it was just a relic, a piece of history that held no more secrets. Donna Eleonora had also changed. Although her health remained fragile, there was a new vitality in her eyes, a glimmer of peace and gratitude that Clara had never seen before. The aches and fatigue that had seemed inevitable had softened, as if the ritual hadn't only freed Beatrice's spirit, but also lifted the weight of guilt Eleonora had carried for decades. One morning, as Clara prepared tea for Eleonora, the elderly woman called her to her room, her voice softer and sweeter than usual. "Clara, my dear, come here, please. We need to talk." Clara entered the room and saw Eleonora sitting in a chair by the window, from where she could observe the mansion's gardens. For the first time, Clara noticed a slight smile on the elderly woman's lips, an expression that seemed weathered by time, but also purified by recent revelations. Eleonora gestured to a chair beside her, and Clara sat down, waiting in silence as the elderly woman seemed to gather her thoughts. "I don't know how I can express how grateful I am to you, Clara," Eleonora began, her voice thick with emotion. "For years, I was tormented by this house, by the secrets I kept in silence, by my family's mistakes, and by the loss of Beatrice. The guilt consumed me, and I never imagined I would live to feel the peace I feel now." Clara gently squeezed the elderly woman's hand. "It was a burden no one should have to carry alone, Mrs. Eleonora. It wasn't your fault. The curse was here long before, and you did the best you could to protect the family." Eleonora nodded, tears shining in her aged eyes. "I know that now, but you've done more than any of us could have imagined. And for that, Clara, I want to offer you something that should have been yours all along." The elderly woman took a small, weathered envelope from a box beside her, her hands trembling as she handed it to Clara. Clara looked at the envelope with a mix of surprise and curiosity. It was sealed with the Cardoso family crest, a symbol she recognized from some of the old objects she'd seen in the attic. "This is your rightful inheritance, Clara," Eleonora explained, her voice steady. "It's the will that names you as my legitimate heir. Everything that belongs to this family now belongs to you. The mansion, the land, and all that remains of the Cardoso fortune." Clara felt her heart quicken. It was an immense responsibility, a legacy rich with history, full of both light and shadow. She thought about everything the house represented, the secrets, the horrors, but also the memories now at peace. She had never dreamed of owning any of it, but she knew that, in a way, fate had placed her there for a reason. Mrs. Eleonora, I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting this. I didn't expect anything really, she said, moved. But I accept, and I promise to honor this place in our family's history. Eleonora smiled, a look of relief in her eyes. I knew you were the only one who could do this. And now, my dear, it's time for me to finally rest. I fulfill my duty. You're here, and I know you'll take care of the mansion and what remains of our lineage. Clara sensed that Eleonora's words carried a tone of farewell. She knew the elderly woman was ready to depart, that her weary body and wounded soul longed for final rest. She held Eleonora's hand, feeling the fragile, warm pulse there, and her eyes filled with tears. I'll be here until the end, Mrs. Eleonora, Clara said, her voice full of emotion. And I promise to keep our family story alive, but without the shadows of the past. I'll care for this house, so it becomes a place of peace. In the days that followed, Clara stayed by Eleonora's side, caring for her with tenderness and patience until, on a peaceful night, the elderly woman passed away silently, with a serene expression and a gentle smile on her lips. Clara was holding her hand when she took her last breath, feeling deeply grateful to have been there, to have helped Eleonora find the peace she had long sought. The funeral was simple and respectful, attended only by a few staff members and Clara. Everyone bore the sadness of farewell, yet there was also relief in knowing that at last the cycle of suffering had ended. The curse that had once loomed over the mansion had been broken, and each person present felt the weight of the shadows lifting. After the funeral, Clara walked through the mansion's gardens, letting the soft breeze caress her face. She looked at the grand house, now officially hers, feeling a mix of reverence and responsibility. The weight of past secrets had been replaced by a sense of possibility. She knew the mansion still held memories, but now they were memories at peace. Over the following weeks, Clara began restoring the mansion, transforming it into a brighter, more welcoming place full of life and light. The heavy curtains were removed, the hallways were adorned with flowers, and little by little, the house became a home. She decided to open the mansion's doors for cultural events and guided tours, sharing the story of the Cardoso family, both the good and the difficult parts, as a way to bring renewal and meaning to the place. One night, as she walked through the corridors, Clara passed by the black frame. The photos of the children there, including her own, had lost the dark and mysterious touch they once held. Now, they were simply memories of a family that, finally, had found peace. Clara took her own photo from the frame, holding it for a moment. She smiled at the image of the serious, introspective girl, a child who unknowingly carried the weight of an ancient legacy. Now, that child, that woman, was free to move forward with a new purpose. Over time, the Cardoso mansion became a symbol of renewal. People came from afar to hear stories of ancestors, of the courage and love that had broken through supernatural barriers. Clara became the guardian not only of the house, but of the family's history and her own future. And on the quietest days, she would sometimes feel a slight presence beside her, a cold hand, a gentle whisper. She knew it was Beatrice, her spirit now free, visiting her not as a plea for help, but as a reminder that peace was possible. After all, the curse had been broken, and the mansion that once was a place of suffering had finally become a true home. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.